Imagine that you lived along the coast and couldn't touch the water or go into the water because of some toxic organisms. Imagine you go to the beach, hoping to spend some time with your family and friends, and you see a dead marine animal laying along the coast. How would living near a toxic body of water make you feel? What would you want to do to bring awareness to this situation? I'm Trevor Burrows.
I'm Emily Kaluuya.
I'm Chris Maxon.
I'm Sydney Ferris.
And I'm Thais Mazariegos.
3 degrees. It can be the difference between snow
According to a new
and sleet.
United Nations report, has caused climate change.
And in this podcast, we're going to be diving deeper into the harsh effects of the red tide in the Tampa Bay area and how it's affecting the stakeholders. First, Emily's going to lead us into a more general understanding to get our audience familiar with what the red tide is. Emily?
Thank you, Trevor. So basically, since the 1800s, Florida's west coast has shown cases of the red tide blooms, and Florida's red tides are predominantly associated with the blooms and have been known to spread to the east coast of Mexico through the Gulf of Mexico and to the shores of North Carolina. The Florida red tide comes from a toxic dinoflagellate called Carina brevis, or K. brevis for short, and is formerly known as Gymnodium breve and Cytidiscus brevis. And K. brevis produces a group of potent natural neurotoxins that kind of pollute the ocean and the waters that they're in, which is along the Florida's coast. And these toxins can cause illnesses and mortalities in fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. This means that if the blooms are present in the oceans near the tide, the animal ecosystem within is contaminated and now can be seen as toxic. And Thais will get more into that later on into the podcast. A little background on the red tide is that in the 1980s and in the 1990s, these harmful algae blooms, also called HABs for short, gained a lot more attention and research as it started being seen on other coastlines as well as having effects on the health of animals and humans. And the Florida red tide has, in the last 10 years, has gained momentum because of how drastic it has affected the marine life in the Florida coast. And there are warnings set and raised when the Florida red tide invades the coast, as it has health risks to be in the water to both animals and humans as well. And the Florida red tide happens during the months of August and December because the algae blooms are blooming, yet there can be only blooms that deviate from these months. So basically, the Florida red tide happens through August and December, but it can always happen any other time in any other months and any other seasons. And the Florida red tide actually occurs annually. So everyone in Florida, especially the Tampa Bay area, will be affected by the red tide. When the algae blooms are present, the water changes color because of the organisms blooming, hence the term red tide. And at this time, there is no explanation for why the blooming of algae occurs, and there's no explanation in what temperature, and no one ever knows what conditions the Florida red tide occurs in. And the tide is called the red tide because of the presence of the organisms that cause the water to turn a hint of red. The Florida red tide is present at the coast of the ocean because of a system called upwelling, which is a process of which deep, cold, and nutrient-rich water rises to the surface, which basically pushes the toxins to the coastline. Winds and ocean currents then bring the bloom inshore, where it has an impact on all our coast, which then impacts humans as well as animals alike. K. brevis, like all algae, requires 3 things to grow and survive: optimal light, temperature, and nutrients, and specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. And the sources of these nutrients vary among the offshore, nearshore, and then the environment as a whole, but it can be mostly present in the shoreline, so through the areas with lower tides. And then nutrient sources also vary spatially, whether it's from north to south. And basically what this means is nutrient sources can happen in Sarasota in Florida, and that those may differ from those south of Sarasota in Fort Myers. And then K. brevis is only one of the several species of the genus of this toxin. And there's Carina, which is also found throughout the world's oceans, but there are more specific ones and more specific species in other regions. So the ones in Florida aren't just the only ones present in the environment or in oceans and other regions. These toxins can be suspended in the air near beaches and cause human respiratory illnesses, which Thais will talk about more. And they can also accumulate in shellfish and cause neurotoxic shellfish poisoning in humans. So you always have to be careful when getting shellfish from the tide during these months, just because it can cause poisoning within humans. And while these events are most frequent in coastal regions of Southwest Florida, they occur to a lesser extent throughout the Gulf region. And lastly, about the red tide, harmful algae blooms occur nearly every summer along the nation's coasts. Often the bloom turns red, like I've said, and while many people call these events the red tide, scientists actually prefer the term harmful algae bloom, which I've mentioned, the little shorter term HAB or HAB. And this can cause, and in all, the red tide or HAB results from the rapid growth of microscopic algae, if we want to kind of summarize what the red tide is in one sentence.
Emily, thank you so much for really engaging your audience and instructing them on what actually the red tide, or HAB, as you'd like for it to be called, is. And now that we have a better understanding, we're going to zoom in a little bit as Chris takes us to a place called Piney Point Phosphate Plant and show how it affects and how it is perpetuating the red tide in the area, and what are the greater effects of us humans are to the red tide. Chris?
Okay, yeah, Trevor. So basically, the main talk amongst the community that's fueling the red tide was the Piney Point phosphate plant. It's a plant that produces fertilizer. And in late March, about 200 million gallons of nutrient-rich wastewater was poured into Tampa Bay. And then, as said before by Emily, algae blooms was spawned, and all this like aggravated the red tide. And then all this red tide, the algae blooms, they produce toxins that kill fish, birds, sea turtles, that basically damage the whole ecosystem. And even it got to a point where the residents had to evacuate due to the buildup of all the fish and all the wastewater. It was going to cause a collapse on the wall of the reservoir by the phosphate plant. In an interview by Tom Fraser, who's the dean at the University of South Florida College of Marine Science, he talked about how the spill wasn't also the main contribution to the red tide, but it did help push it forward. There was a lot of other recent spills and stuff that added to it. And then some somewhat good news that came out of it was the legislator of the Department of Environmental Protection basically made the phosphate plant have to shut down. They were gonna mothball it. So they set aside $100 million in federal coronavirus relief money for the work, and it's said to be permanently shut down by December 2024.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for the deeper dive into Piney Point and how it's really starting a large portion of this red tide. Now that we have a more overview of what the red tide is and a deeper understanding of what it's coming from, we're going to go to a more personal side of this issue by interviewing a stakeholder from the area. One of our podcast members, Sydney Ferris, has found a stakeholder of the area and conducted an interview. Sydney, would you like to go ahead?
Okay, now we're going to welcome our guest, Katie Crocco, who lives in the Tampa Bay area. Hello. Like Sydney said, my name is Katie Karatko, and I attend the University of South Florida in Tampa. I am a marketing major, and I'm here to help Sydney with her project.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to get into our questions. First, what is your personal experience with the red tide in the Tampa Bay area?
All right, so my particular experience with red tide was at Davis Island Dog Beach. Last summer in August, my friends and I went there just to get some sun and hopefully dip in the water. But when we got there, we knew that was not an option because it's a really small and secluded beach, but it was covered with red seaweed. But in my opinion, the absolute worst part about red tide is the amount of fish that are killed and washed ashore, which ends up creating a horrible, horrible stench.
Yeah, that does not sound enjoyable. Okay, for the next question, how has the red tide affected you and people you know?
So this was a big lesson learned for me. One summer, I decided to walk past the seaweed bundles and kind of push them to the side and swim in the water. And it wasn't until about 10 minutes after I got out that I felt this stinging sensation in both of my eyes, and then my vision was a little blurred. So I went to the restroom to check my eyes, and I jumped at what I saw because my eyes were completely bloodshot, and soon after that I couldn't even open them because it just felt like someone was blowing into my eyes. Luckily it wore off throughout the day, and then it also happened to my cousin Joe on that same day because we both went in the water, and our parents told us not to, but we didn't really realize that would happen. But I guess it was just the toxins from the seaweed mixed with the fish stench. It was not a good mix.
Yeah, that sounds horrible. I'm sorry that happened. Now, for the next question, what do you think should be done to help mitigate this issue?
So I don't really believe there's a specific thing we can do about red tide because it's a natural deed of nature. However, I think that beach patrol, we've always thought this, that beach patrol or someone who takes care of beaches should be in charge of clearing the seaweed from the beach and the water. Just because it's in the water, it kills all the fish, and as well, it could do that to some people's eyes, and it is a horrible, horrible smell either way. But that's one thing, I don't know if it would get rid of the stench if the seaweed and everything was cleared. But I think that would definitely be a start, especially getting it out of the water to prevent that many fish from dying.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Thank you so much for your time and answering these questions. It really helps with our research on this subject to have a personal inside source. So thank you so much.
Of course.
Sydney and Katie, thank you so much. We really appreciate Katie coming onto the podcast. That was fantastic. Sydney, I appreciate you reaching out. Lastly, we're going to jump in as Tia explains the environmental effects. We've kind of jumped around a little bit, getting different viewpoints, getting an overview, zooming into the causes, seeing how it's affecting the people. And now we're going to look at the overall overarching environmental effects. That goes past the scientific and past how it's affecting people. Tias, would you like to explain that a little more?
Yes. So as we have mentioned, the red tide has had a major impact on the marine environment. According to the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida, the red tide plays a major role in the creation of dead zones, which is an area of water where aquatic life cannot survive because of low oxygen levels. They are created when the algae responsible for red tide starts to die, and this takes a major toll on the marine animals. The algae's decaying process consumes the oxygen, causing fish and other sea creatures to die in large numbers. The fish that get stuck in this area are not able to escape because the lack of oxygen causes them to lose consciousness immediately. The effect that the red tide has on marine life can go as far as affecting humans and other marine animals who come into contact with these fishes. I know this was mentioned earlier. In one area that humans and animals have to be very careful is when they are about to consume shellfish, because you can get shellfish poisoning by eating fish that have died from these toxins. The red tide has also had a major effect on the Florida stone crab, which is one of the most economically important fisheries in Florida. During a recent study conducted by MOTE Marine Laboratory and Aquarium, it was discovered that 90% of the larvae in the control group swam upward as expected. However, 60% of the larvae that had been placed in the high concentrations of red tide moved downward. Their swimming speed and reduced oxygen consumption suggested that they were most likely incapacitated due to their exposure to the red tide. The red tide has also had a major effect on algae, which are plant-like organisms that sustain marine life. They contribute to the food chain and to the oxygen that keeps water bodies healthy. However, sometimes algae can be called blooms when they grow quickly and overpopulate. These blooms, I know how it has been mentioned before, they can seem like foam, mats, or paint on the surface of water, and it can also change the color of the water to green, blue, brown, red, or another color. Many of these blooms are pushed to the shore by winds, waves, tides, and currents, and at times they can release toxins that have a negative impact on animals. Harmful algae blooms are temporary and usually happen during the late summer or early fall. How I've mentioned, this algae is known for producing natural toxins, which can lead to death among dolphins, turtles, marine birds, and manatees. These toxins are so powerful that exposed fish begin to swim erratically, become paralyzed, and then die within an hour of exposure. It has also been shown that these toxins can produce a foam that causes seabirds to lose the waterproofing on their feathers, which can result in their death. During July 2021, scientists feared a large bloom was about to happen after the Piney Point stack dumped nutrient-rich wastewater into Tampa's waters in April. The elevated concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus were some of the most concerning descriptors because they are known to fuel phytoplankton growth, which can lead to a potentially toxic algae bloom. And in 2018, there was actually they declared a state of emergency in 7 counties of Florida's west coast due to the red tide. And as of August of 2018, the bloom had washed up more than 2,000 tons of dead marine life, and the cost for the state was over $8 million for cleanup.
TS, thank you very much for it's really interesting to see such the profound impact that the red tide has had on wildlife and state funding. Like I said, $8 million cost to the state, a state of emergency under the people. It's pretty easy to see the red tide is very prolific of how intense it can be onto the community from an ecological standpoint, from a personal standpoint, an economic standpoint. It's really an intense thing that leads us into my last point that I'd like to make. It's pretty obvious to see that this red tide is very obviously a human impact, a human issue, something that's been created by our negligence to the environment that's now costing us money on the back end. So us as a podcast, I believe all of us are calling for a government interaction, a government intervention to stop pollutants and waste dumping being flowed into the Tampa Bay area to stop the harmful red tide. This should be something that everyone should be aware of. I think everyone on the podcast is going to agree here that the red tide shouldn't be something that people can just overlook. If it killed, was it 2 million or 200 million wildlife?
Yes, it was 2,000 tons of dead marine life that washed up.
2,000 tons of dead marine wildlife and $8 million in a state of emergency. Like I've already said, this isn't something that is a bad thing humans have done, and we'll just be upset about it. We're demanding direct government intervention to put direct halt to this kind of practice, like at the Piney Point phosphate area. We need government intervention to stop any more plans to continue to do this. We've talked about, as Chris said, there was a mothball thing put in, a mothball effect to put into Piney Point, but we can't let any other chemical plants continue or be built to have this same kind of process. Anyways, as we wrap up, I would like to thank my other fellow members of the podcast, Chris, Emily, Sydney, Tia, for your amazing work, and for our fantastic guest speaker, Katie. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and giving us your personal insight to how much this has affected you. I would like to thank Texas A&M for giving us a platform to host and to speak our voice about the environmental issue. And thank our audience for coming out to listen to such an important thing that we now hold dear to our hearts.
Three degrees. It can be the difference between snow
According to a new
and sleet.
United Nations report, the caused climate change.